My name is Michael Spett, Michael Davis Spett. My middle name is named after my grandfather who died just a year before I was born. His Hebrew name was David Yitzchak. So even in Belgium, where I was born, Brussels, Belgium, it sounds like an American name, but I was named Davis. So that always helped me a little sometimes when people didn't know if I was Jewish or not. It didn't sound like a Jewish name, and I always felt that might have even helped me get into college. So this was in August 14, 1934 is my birth date. So if I do the math correctly, that'll make me 85 in almost 2 months. And I'm pleased to be able to tell a little bit of our story of what I remember. In May 1940, which is the important date, I was almost 6 years old. My younger sister was born also in August, Gabriella, but always known as Gaby. And she was born 1937, making her 3 years younger than me. So then my father was in France called Henri, but although he was born in Poland in, I think, December 8th, 1898, in Podgorza, which is a suburb of Krakow. But family migrated to Germany when he was about 5 years old, and he grew up always being Heine, which is the equivalent of Henry in the United States, Henri in France. So, and my mother was born in Germany on August 10th, 1906. And her name was Liesel, but also Lizzie, but she went by the name of Liesel. So at the time, this of the critical time that we're going to be talking about starts in 1940, when the Nazis bombed Brussels, beginning the war essentially on May 10th, 1940. Well, being just 5.5 years old or so, I have very few memories of Belgium, other than what I heard from stories that we heard around the dinner table every Friday night. My parents were very happy with living in Belgium. There was a great social life among the Jewish people, and although living in Brussels, they had many connections with their fellow Zionists in Antwerp, all diamond dealers and so on. And they often spoke later on how during the war they had every intention of going back to Belgium because it was a very satisfying life there. The reason they got to Belgium is a story I should tell about my father, talking about how resourceful they was. After he graduated Frankfurt University with a degree in economics or business degree, anyway, he was publishing for the Blau Weiss, the newsletter, and he was the editor. And there he'd working in a printing shop, a small printing shop in Wiesbaden, which is the city that he grew up in. And he really got taken watching how type was set and how things in the presses would work. And he really fell in love with it, as a lot of other people have told me they sometimes do. Anyhow, from printing and finally being able during the hyperinflation, he bought the printing plant, and when the old man retired, he really had developed himself a very good business. Came 1933 when Hitler came to power. Nowadays, the first thing they do is a coup. They grab the television stations, and that's what they did. The first thing Hitler did, he shut down the Jewish, or confiscated the Jewish printers, and the Seventh-day Adventists, I think, also. One night, my father, because he had all these contacts with the city of Wiesbaden, got a phone call from one of his buddies in the police department who said, "You better get out of town because they're coming after you tomorrow morning." So that's how resourceful he was. He left in the middle of the town at night. The next day, they grabbed the plant. They arrested my mother, put her in a paddy wagon, and she was sitting in prison for a couple of days because she was the secretary of the company, and they confiscated everything. And she was freed later on, but they were not married then. She was just the secretary. So this was, I think, in April, maybe a little May, I'm not sure, May 1933. And they held her responsible for being an officer of the printing plant. And so they kept an eye, they were after him, and she said she was being followed. She was very uncomfortable. It was like the movies. I have all this, what I know is everything that my mother wrote in her memoir. And on May 10th, as I said, the bombs started falling, and we were living in Brussels with my Uncle Max and his wife Tante Gina and their two children, Ruth and Harry. And my mother wrote that they were debating, Max and Gina, whether they should leave. It was a question, who knows what's going to happen? They decided finally to leave on the 13th after the bombs were still falling. Anyway, they went to the train to get to Paris. And Max, excuse me, Max and her family, and Egon, who was living with us. Egon was my cousin, the son of my father's sister, Gusta Schul, who was deported by the Germans at the year before, 2 years before, because they were not German citizens. They were living there. All the Jews living in Germany were still Polish citizens, and that's how they did it. And somehow, they got Egon, the youngest son of the three sons, they managed to get him out and to stay with his uncle in Brussels. One other son went to Israel. He was an older one, went to Palestine, and he was in the British, in the Jewish Legion of the British Army. And the other two brothers also, together with their parents, ultimately perished in the camps. The train was supposed to go to Paris, which is, I think, maybe now about an hour, in those days, 3 hours. This train we were sealed train for 3 days. My father called it the train from hell. The tracks to Paris were bombed, so they had a detour all around. And for other reasons, there were detours. I think that one time the train was strafed, but that's not a memory, that's something I heard. As you can imagine, it was very crowded. You couldn't get off. At every station, soldiers were standing there, and they wouldn't let anybody off the train. Maybe they could get something to eat, but it must have been very difficult. And can imagine what the sanitary conditions must have been like. But finally, my mother wrote at 5 o'clock in the morning, when she looked out the window, they were in a station. It turned out to be Bordeaux. Okay, so the train was still sealed, and my father took me aside and said, when the doctor comes, he wanted to have, let me back up a minute. My mother wrote how difficult 1940 was because I had asthma and I had some terrible attacks. So now when I go to the schools and then tell the kids, the middle school kids, they have a Holocaust survivor. Although I don't have a number on my arm, I call myself a Holocaust escapee. they expect an old guy to start telling the stories about the camps and so on. So I come in there and I ask the kids, how many of you have asthma? And they're right away taken aback because they thought I'm going to talk about camps. Maybe half the class might be raising a hand. And then I say, how many of you have ever faked a asthma attack? And they look around and this, and finally one kid might raise his hand, then the other one, and they are. So that's a story. Anybody who has asthma realizes that to gain sympathy, a child will fake an attack once in a while. So my father takes me aside. He says, have an attack. I couldn't fool my father. He knew when I was kidding, you know. So with that, he was able to get to the station master. We were the only ones to get allowed off the train. What went on between him and the station master, I'm not sure. But he came back, and then my mother, she couldn't imagine. The train was so long. She's looking what happened to, you know. But finally, they found out we were the only family to get off that train, because ultimately the Vichy French were putting them into camps, the Vichy French camps, right near Rive Salt and other bad camps that had already been set up when they had, from the Spanish Civil War, they were taking all the refugees from Spain, putting them in there. So they had those camps, and that's where my Uncle Max and Tante Gina and Harry and Ruth, they were on the train and they wound up in Rive Salt. And from the stories they told, that was not a good place. And sometimes some of those people wound up in the Dachau and the extermination camps when the Vichy sent them up there. So anyway, we were the only ones to get off that train, and so we were free and clear in Bordeaux. Train stations are all outdoors, and they have glass ceilings. And there must have been a bombing raid the night before the train arrived there, because when we were walking, my father and I, to go to where we were going to go, to station masters, there was glass all over the station platform. At that time, I guess they were just trying to set themselves up to establish a family. I have two little kids, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. They wanted to get away from all the refugees and to try to maintain a normal life. And they were in this farmhouse. She must have had an extra couple of rooms, and she made sure that the children would only go around in the back, not to bring in their muddy shoes in the house. But towards a couple of days later, at one point, Madame Santou was her name, and it was Pessac. Pessac is a wine suburb of Bordeaux. She went in there and says, "Allez-vous-en, get the hell out of here. Votre sale roi a capitulé. King Leopold, your lousy King Leopold surrendered." Now, Leopold was married to a German in first place, and it was a scandal. But they thought we were Belgians, and instead of Polish and German and Jews and everything else. So we had to find another place. So anyway, in walking and going from consulate to consulate, my dad one time walked along a street and heard the familiar sounds of a printing press. So he went in and started to talk. So anyway, my father struck up a conversation and a friendship with the printing plant owner in Bordeaux, and telling him his story. And the fellow said, "Listen, I got a beach house in Lacanau, which is about a 20-minute train ride, and it's the beach place it's like the Hamptons for Bordeaux." And he says, "It's only May, you can stay in there." So I was very happy for my father. We were playing Gaby and I was on the beach, and it was the Hamptons of Bordeaux. So that's how we were in Lacanau, and every morning my father would get on the train and commute to Bordeaux to see how we can get out, because it's just a question of time before the Nazi armies would be coming down there. So one night, my father had heard that the Portuguese consulate was giving passports to everybody. Okay. And what he did is he sent a telegram to his wife in Lacano to explain, I'm not going to be home tonight. But this was delivered a day later. But meanwhile, she went through a night of hell. So, but from what I heard is there were hundreds of people who were doing the same thing, and they all stayed in the courtyard overnight instead of going somewhere else so they can keep their place in line more or less without any really facilities to stay overnight. And that's what he did. He stayed overnight. And this is the same story I told when the RTP made the movie in the late 1980s, how he stayed there and then got up there and went up the stairs and got a visa. So the next problem was how to get out of Portugal. And the only way to get out of Portugal by land on the Iberian Peninsula is to go through Spain. So he had to go to get the Spanish passport. And they were still from the Republican Army, from the Civil War. They were not that friendly. And so they made him wait and so on. So he went and said, wait a minute, I have my passport inside already. So the guys let him in. Before that, the guards wouldn't even let him in. So he did get in, which is the first step. So he got in and he saw this whole stack of passports on the desk. He says, oh, my passport must be in there somewhere. And the fellow says, okay. And go, and then the phone rang, and the fellow goes to answer the phone. My father takes his passport out of the pocket and slips it in the pile. And the guy comes back, he says, here's my passport. He pulled it out, and the guy stamped it, and then that's how he got into Spain. Of course, I wouldn't be able to distinguish whether we're free or not at a 5.5-year-old. But I think until they were on the boat, I don't think they really felt safe, because what was to do with Hitler invading and running over France, which was supposed to be so, with the Maginot Line, invincible, and having the Spanish, any day the Spanish could join Hitler and become allies, and the next thing go invade Portugal. That was one of very realistic fears at the time. So I don't think they really felt free until they were on that boat. We went on because we were in Portugal from end of May until December 1940. So that's 6 months, over 6 months. And in that period in Porto, and later on we moved to Lisbon, my father did everything he could to get into the United States, to get visas and to get, and that was very difficult. It's was hard. So he had to make connections with the people he knew in the United States. One of the first things he did is he bought a typewriter. And as a matter of fact, we still had this it was a Portuguese Olympus, actually a German Olympus, a German typewriter. And he was writing letters to the United States back and forth. My mother had an uncle who was a wine merchant in New York, Alphonse Weil, who helped us and supported us financially, and also made connections that he knew because he was in charge. There was a large importer, and my father, from his boyhood friends from Blau Weiss and this Zionist youth organization in Germany, Nachum Goldman and Egon Zeitlin and so on. And Nachum Goldman was already in America and then head of the World Jewish Congress, and he had connections. So with Stephen Weiss, Rabbi Weiss of the Free Synagogue in New York, the Reform Synagogue, they did everything to get us visas, and we had to get affidavits. My father had cousins on his mother's side who had come to the United States and landed because Mr. Schiff, the publisher of, later on the publisher of the Post, but one of the rich German Jews who lived in New York, they felt there were too many Polish Jews coming to New York, so they made sure that some of them would go to Texas. So Galveston became a port of entry for Polish Jews. And his cousins and his uncles went to Texas, wound up in Texas. And they had established themselves very well. And one of them, Hyman Brand, was an American GI in the First World War and visited his aunt and uncle after the armistice, and so they became friendly. And my father connected with him during that time and asked, "Can you give me an affidavit?" And those are the things he did with if he would have had a computer, life would have been a lot easier. Then did a lot of typing. The name of the boat that we left on was the Nyassa. The first boat we had, that's where my mother's uncle, Alphonse Weil, had connections with Moore McCormick, was the shipping line. And he got us a passage on a Greek boat because he had connections with the shipping line. They got with a Greek boat, something Helenas. But then that was supposed to be in, I don't know, September, October. But that's when Italy invaded Greece, and all of a sudden Greece is in the war. And I know some earlier of De Souza Mendes's visas left and made it to the United States, but I think that boat was sunk after, so then they had to wait. And we had to wait until December, and then they found a Portuguese boat, Nyassa. And Nyassa is, I was a stamp collector in my childhood. I was familiar. Nyassa was a Portuguese colony near Mozambique. And this was a banana boat, really. And they converted it to passengers, and they took the New York, Lisbon route. Now, I don't know if he ever met De Souza Mendes. As a matter of fact, I have to say that in all the stories we heard around the dining table at night, we didn't know the name. But it was only later on when I started to print a book about the Courage to Care, and then there was no photograph. They were talking about Wallenberg and other consuls who did great work. And De Souza Mendes, that's the first time I learned that De Souza Mendes was the consul general in Bordeaux. And there were no photographs in the back. There's a lot of photographs of families and everybody in this book, The Courage to Care. There was a dearth, there was no photograph of De Souza Mendes. So I asked my mother, show me the passport, and there was his signature. So we reproduced that passport on the pages of telling the story about him. And that's how I got to know Souza Mendes. I had this question asked to me if you were sitting next to somebody on the plane, who would you prefer to have somebody who's well known to have a conversation with on a long flight? And so essentially the same thing if I met Souza Mendes. I now know a little bit more of your background, and having gotten involved with printing about you and having made a movie with public television in Portugal and so on, and what you went through. The question still remains is what really impelled you to do all this at the sacrifice of your status and your mansions and your aristocracy and so on, and to die the way you did. And it was, that is really the question, because you talk about Courage to Care. That's why he was put in the back, because it was a great sacrifice. of his entire career, and to die in poverty because he saved, over 10,000 Jews. And who knows how many other non-Jews. I think 30,000 people altogether, and contrary to his president's orders, distinct orders. So he's really something, admirable personality, and very, very moving story.